The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is at its lowest level since 1983, and it's expected to drop further. The Iran war unleashed the largest physical supply disruption in the history of the oil market. Essentially, the U.S. government is loaning oil companies crude oil from the U.S. SPR that they will then have to return after the end of the exchange program. This will be a slow process.
Canada is quietly gaining the upper hand, while the United States is running out of its emergency oil backup. Canada now has the power to choose where its oil goes next, and that decision could leave America in a very difficult position. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve has fallen to approximately 319.5 million barrels, its lowest level since the early 1980s. In March 2026, the Trump administration authorized a 172 million barrel release as part of a broader International Energy Agency effort involving 400 million barrels from member countries. At the same time, Canada supplied 63.4% of all U.S. crude oil imports in 2025. The emergency stockpile is draining. The dominant replacement supply is Canadian. And Canada is simultaneously building Pacific export infrastructure that gives it the option to redirect those same barrels to Asia rather than south. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created following the 1970s oil shocks to give the United States a national buffer against import disruptions. It is stored in underground salt caverns at 4 Gulf Coast sites and was authorized to hold hundreds of millions of barrels more than its current level. The Department of Energy has described the SPR as the world's largest emergency crude supply. The Government Accountability Office has documented that major drawdowns and maintenance demands are straining the system, creating a policy trade-off between using the reserve quickly during supply emergencies and preserving the infrastructure's long-term reliability for future shocks. The March 2026 release was framed by the Trump administration as a response to Middle East instability following the Iran conflict's disruption of Strait of Hormuz shipping. The IEA coordinated the broader 400 million barrel member country release to cool supply fears and reduce the risk of a price shock reaching drivers, airlines, truckers, and factories. The White House described much of the release as an emergency exchange rather than a straightforward sale. Companies receiving crude now with the obligation to return more barrels later. In one early tranche, the Energy Department said companies would receive 45.2 million barrels and return 55 million barrels, creating a paper gain for the reserve over time. That paper gain does not address the vulnerability in the interval between the drawdown and the replenishment. Canada supplied 63.4% of all U.S. crude oil imports in 2025, making it not just a trading partner, but a core pillar of American refinery supply. Canada also exported approximately 4.3 million barrels per day of crude oil overall, with roughly 3.9 million barrels per day going to the United States. That means the American emergency response is happening in a market where Canadian barrels already serve as the dominant foreign supply source, a market where any disruption to Canadian crude flows would compound the SPR's current vulnerability rather than operating independently of it. Forbes reported in April 2026 that Canada was responsible for a record 61% of U.S. oil imports in 2025, with the figure subsequently updated to 63.4% in later data. The trajectory is upward. Canada's share of U.S. crude imports has been increasing for 2 decades, with Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City research finding that U.S. imports of Canadian oil doubled over that period. Midwest refineries processed roughly 2.8 million barrels per day of Canadian oil in 2024, a concentration that reflects decades of infrastructure investment in pipelines, refinery, coking equipment, and logistical systems built specifically around Alberta heavy crude. The Midwest dependence is the dimension of the story that converts an abstract trade statistic into a daily price reality for American consumers. Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City research confirmed that Canadian oil is important for Midwest gasoline prices. Refineries in Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin are configured to process heavy sour crude, the type that Alberta's oil sands produce. Switching those refineries to lighter domestic shale crude would require capital expenditure in the hundreds of millions of dollars per facility and operational downtime that reduces throughput The economic and logistical barriers to replacing Canadian heavy crude with domestic alternatives are not temporary. They're structural, built into the physical equipment and contractual relationships that govern Midwest refinery operations. Statistics Canada reported that crude oil extraction reached a record level in 2025, while crude oil exports also climbed to a record. A key shift was that exports to countries other than the United States rose sharply, helped by expanded West Coast access through the Trans Mountain expansion. For the first time in the current Statistics Canada data series, non-US destinations drove the overall increase in Canadian crude exports. Even so, US-bound exports still totaled 222.7 million cubic meters in 2025, confirming that Canada's diversification is adding Pacific volume on top of its existing American relationships rather than replacing American sales with Asian ones. The Trans Mountain expansion's commercial trajectory demonstrates how the Pacific optionality changes Canada's negotiating position even without dramatically reducing American import volumes. The expanded system carries up to 890,000 barrels per day to Tidewater at Burnaby, British Columbia. Tanker liftings at the Westridge Marine Terminal increased from approximately 5 per month before the expansion to approximately 35 per month following its May 2024 commercial service commencement. The WCS-WTI price differential, the discount Alberta producers accepted for decades because they had no alternative buyer, narrowed from an average of $18.70 per barrel before the expansion to $12.00 per barrel in the 13 months following startup. American refineries are now paying more for Canadian crude than they paid before the Pacific competition existed. The Kansas City Fed analysis of Canadian oil's importance for Midwest gasoline prices identified the specific commercial mechanism connecting Canadian crude supply to consumer fuel costs. When Canadian crude inventories at the Cushing, Oklahoma storage hub, the physical delivery point for WTI futures, tightened due to Canadian production disruptions or export redirection, WTI prices respond. A Reuters report from June 2026 documented exactly that. Canadian oil outages and bad weather tightened inventories at Cushing, affecting pricing across the American crude oil market. The episode showed in real time that American oil market mechanics remain sensitive to Canadian supply, not as a long-term trade flow pattern, but as an immediate market pricing signal. The SPR's current level of approximately 319.5 million barrels represents the country's emergency cushion at a moment when Canada's Pacific pipeline infrastructure is expanding, and the proportion of Alberta crude redirected toward Asian buyers is growing. The United States cannot refill the SPR quickly. The Department of Energy describes the underground salt cavern system as technically complex to restore after large drawdowns. Commercial crude oil inventories provide some additional buffer, but they serve active refinery demand rather than emergency reserve functions. The gap between what the SPR holds today and what it held before the current drawdown cycle began is a gap that cannot be closed by domestic shale production alone, not because American production capacity is insufficient, but because the specific crude grades that Gulf Coast and Midwest refineries are configured to process come predominantly from Canada, and the types of imported crude that replace Canadian supply when it is unavailable